Okay, now that we've blocked out a lot of our building, um, we're about to get into the process of actually popping this building out, popping the pieces out a little bit more, and actually starting to get into what essentially will become our image. So I'm bringing out my reference yet again, looking at the buildings that I'm going to be using. Now, mind you, I'm actually combining images here. You're not tied to anything in your reference. You're not tied to anything in terms of what you have to do. For example, right here, I'm looking at a building that I like, and I like that pose. I like the image there. But that doesn't mean it's going to look exactly like those buildings. I'm using those buildings as my starting off point. Reestablishing my horizon and now establishing new lines. I'm basically making my grid more and more complicated as I go along. The reason for this is I'm going to be using all these lines eventually to do windows, to do ledges, to do the basic elements of distance and mass that are going to be so necessary for this image to actually work. Um, Perspective's a tricky thing. Essentially, and I do mention it in the book, said the action that it's essentially an illusion because our ground is not 100% flat, and we even though the world seems flat, I'm pretty sure it's very well documented by the Spanish that the world is actually not flat at all. So that applies to even our immediate world. I mean, whenever we construct and whatnot, planes don't really like set streets don't really exist. It's just an illusion right now. So what you build with perspective is essentially an illusion of this flat area. However, we understand it as real because it feels like it's connected. If you look out the window, it does feel flat. It does look flat, even though it is an illusion. So you have to adhere to some of those rules as you work on some of these pieces. So you're making the distance between all these windows work, and you're making the imagery work as you measure them out. Drawing lines out from each one of the windows. Obviously, I'm only covering one side, and I'm really focusing on the bigger building because it's the one that's probably going to have the most windows and it's probably going to occupy the most space. This, not gonna lie, looks a little tedious, but it's really effective, and it's actually not that bad. You get into it as you start doing it. I mean, a lot of people don't like to draw backgrounds because they call it the boring part. They really do like to draw the super people, the people that are actually going to punch each other, or the cartoon characters that are going to hit each other with mallets. But truth of the matter is, the background is such a big, important part of your story that getting into the background is really interesting if you let it. Getting all those pieces right and getting all those environment elements right so that you can actually feel the scene have some level of weight. Um, it feeds the story. You can see I did all the lined out parts in the corners. And now I'm going to be moving on to measuring out the next side of my building, and along that, the next side of my grid. Alright, now that we have one side of the building pretty much done and one side of our grid done, I have to just go back to the second side and really piece it out. Once again, the ruler. Now I'm measuring out and making sure that my grid has been working and all the pieces are working pretty well together. Um, I'm starting to do the divisions on my windows. Here I'm being a little arbitrary, but generally there is a measurement that you can actually do as you move further and further. The way I like to measure them out is by base of x's as you move on, which would mean like within one set of lines do multiple x's from one point to another until you get to the end, and that way you can figure out diminishing distance between items as they go further and further away. Here I'm blocking it out a little bit by sight, only because the immediacy of the piece and also how quickly I tend to draw these. Again, I can imagine somebody looking at this going, this is a little tedious, but it already gives it a lot of weight. It feels like it has weight. In a minute we're going to be moving on to the second side of our first building. Drawing a line down, pretty much designating the end of the building. Clarifying that central line to know exactly where I want to stop. And also the back line. Again, those back lines perhaps won't even show up in our final image, but that doesn't matter. The building itself has to look like there's more building than just what the image provides. So now we're going to start doing our windows on the opposite side, and this will actually give a nice sense of weight and mass to the building and a sense of distance to it as well. In this case, if you notice, I'm not doing the wide long lines all the way to the bottom towards the horizon, only because I don't have to worry about buildings behind this specific one, because this is the limit of my image. Let's put lines down. I'm trying to be a little bit more measured here because I want the ruler to stay at the vanishing point, and at the same time I want to provide enough space for the line to move. Throwing lines down. More lines. I'm going to be saying more lines a lot because I'm throwing a lot of lines. Something else that I'm trying to do, and this is why this specific spot is taking a little bit longer, is that I'm trying to unite the lines right at the point where the windows on the other side would start, because buildings are not made unevenly. Generally speaking, the window structure on one side is the same as the window structure on the other, meaning the measurements at which windows and walls are tend to reflect themselves on other sides of buildings. There are some buildings that do break this norm, but for the most part, that is what you get. It's very measured because the idea is that you want the building to be sound so that, nobody has to go to jail for a crumbling building. But because of that, we have to take a little bit longer looking at each one of the lines and actually connecting it all the way through. More lines. Don't worry, getting close. You can see There it is. Building has two sides and lines. Now we'll eventually be moving on to the rest of our buildings and adding some depth to those as well. This concludes this section of our presentation. There's more to come, so please join us in the next chapter and continue working on this background.